Thanks. All right, let's see if this is working. What's working? They put something on me. I don't know. Can you guys hear me? Yes. All right, fine. Then we won't worry what's working.
Yeah, this one.
All right, so I should say, first of all, that though this is supposed to be about Central Asia, and it will be about Central Asia, I am not an expert on Central Asia. I just happen to live there. And since I've been working there for the last 3.5 years, and I'm the kind of person who asks a lot of questions, people tell me things and my students tell me things, and so I try to put those things into some context that makes sense for me. And the context that makes sense for me is a comparison which, as far as I know, people have not really done, except a scholar by the name of Rogers Brubaker to a certain extent, about how national development happened in the Balkans and how national development is happening in Kyrgyzstan and Central Asia. And I can say just quickly that if in the Balkans, I did a lot of work on the former Yugoslavia and wrote various things. And by the time I was there, national development was more or less a done deal. People, that is, knew their national identities, for better or for worse, and knew what they were and what they meant. In Central Asia, I sometimes feel like I'm living in the middle of a laboratory of nation making, because people still don't entirely know, maybe for better, maybe for worse, what their identities are or what they should be. And they're kind of working them out. And sometimes I think I want to say that the best metaphor is to say that Central Asia is the Balkans in slow motion. But I'm not sure that's entirely true, but we'll see whether that works as I lay out things here today. Now, first of all, if I'm talking about Central Asia, what am I talking about in particular? So we're talking here, at least for the moment, about the 5 former Soviet republics of Central Asia. Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. At various points in history, Central Asia was significantly bigger than this. If one thinks about geographical regions not as some bounded space with lines on a map, but as kind of civilizational places or civilizational ideas, when the steppe was a much more open place, and the Mongols and Timurids and others were wandering around it at somehow amazing speeds when one thinks about how quickly they got around. But it really stretched at that point from Mongolia all the way to Hungary and down into Iran, Afghanistan. But given that the size of current Central Asia, these 5 republics, is about half the size of the continental United States and a population of about 50 million people, probably it's okay to limit ourselves to this small geographical space of contemporary Central Asia. Now, normally when I give this talk, or versions of this talk in the United States or England, nobody knows anything about these places, but here I see there are not only people who know things, but even some colleagues who know quite a lot more than I do about it, so I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time going over things that people know. But we should say that in some respects, the Balkans and Central Asia do have a fair amount in common, as both of them were borderlands of larger empires who were never settled primarily in the territory, but always were coming in and out of the territory, attempting to control it, but never having enough manpower to really form these territories in their own images. So they became kind of classic territories where lots of different people lived. It isn't by any stretch of the imagination true, as some people nostalgic for ages of empires like to say, that somehow they loved each other. They almost certainly did not love each other. In many cases, they had very little to do with each other, which is probably one of the reasons they didn't have to love each other. But they did live in the same places, and sometimes they lived side by side, and they had certain kinds of relationships that were bounded by the realities of their everyday life, and also kept in control to some extent by these external empires, all of whose major interest was having taxes collected from the people who lived on these territories. And of course, from the perspective of empires, as long as people pay their taxes, it doesn't really matter what they do on a day-to-day basis. It doesn't matter what language they speak. It doesn't matter what religion they profess. As long as they don't kill each other and cause problems for the external empire, it's fine. Obviously, once ideas of the nation enter places like this, problems begin to ensue because, as we all know, from the perspective of a nation builder, the ideal nation is one, or an ideal territory for a nation, or territory for a nation state, is one in which all the members of the nation live on the territory that is owned by the state and no one else does. So that you could have nice mono-ethnic or mono-national, depending on how you, in European context, ethnic and linguistic and national tend to be conflated. So you try to create nice, organized, mono-ethnic states. You can describe the history of the Balkans if you want to, and I did in a book I wrote about the history of the Balkans. You can essentially describe the entire history of the 19th century and first half of the 20th century of the Balkans as an attempt to solve this problem, that the wrong people lived in the wrong places and too many of them lived in the wrong places. There are, unfortunately, at least in the European tradition, there are only really three things, and a slight codicil to the fourth one, that you can do if you have the wrong people living in the wrong places. The most humane version the Europeans were ever able to think of was you assimilate them, usually by forced means, educating them to your language, your culture, and making them forget their own. That's, as I say, the most humane version that European states were ever able to figure out. The less humane version is to kick them out and trade populations with other groups of people who also were living in the wrong place, because of course, insofar as your state had the wrong people, so did neighboring states as a rule. And then the third version was to kill them. That was basically your choice. The fourth version, which happens eventually, is when they get to be small enough numbers, you can ignore them again. So then once minority groups get down to some approximately 15% of a state's population in the European ethnic state concept, they can pretty much be ignored as long as they're not overly concentrated in one place and thereby potentially causing trouble or that people think they cause trouble for the group who believes that the nation belongs to it. And this is a kind of situation that for most Americans seems strange. It's not the way the United States functions, clearly. But as I like to remind my friends when they tell me that, Balkan states or Central Asian states should look like the United States, I like to point out that the United States got to be the United States by first killing off the entire native population and bringing in new populations, which turns out to also be an option, but not one that anybody, fortunately, is proposing to use in Central Asia, nor did they use in Europe. So using the American model as a potential multinational model is probably not applicable in Central Asia, nor was it applicable in the Balkans. So by the end of the 20th century, the Balkans had solved, in quotation marks, their national problems. At this point, all Balkan states are pretty much mono-ethnic states. Bulgaria has the largest minority population. It's about 15% Turkish speaking. All the other states are above 90% belonging to the titular nationality of the state. And lo and behold, not surprising in a European context, but very unfortunate to people who would like there to be some a different, more humane, more 21st century way of organizing people. Lo and behold, only now have these states stopped fighting with each other. And the only exceptions still in the Balkans are those few, I call them Indian reservations, states where Balkan diversity, which many of us love so much. Those of us who are scholars love it because it makes things interesting. Those of us who are members of European OSCE delegations love it because it makes them feel less guilty about having gotten rid of the minorities in their own countries. Only those Indian reservations that still are organized that way, Bosnia-Herzegovina and Macedonia, neither of which work, are left as multinational states. Well, if we move to Central Asia, we see some important similarities and some important differences, and both of them will, I think, become significant for what I want to talk about. The Central Asian states came to understanding themselves as potentially national states significantly later than the Balkan states did. In the Balkans, this happened between the 18-teens and the 1850s. Most of these national identities were more or less set, though there was still some contestation about them beyond that. In Central Asia, this didn't really happen until the 1880s, 1890s, when Russian Tsarist colonization was more or less complete in that part of the world, and colonial administrators began to try to figure out who these people were. And they tried to figure out who these people were using European understandings of people. And it's worth pointing out that they had a variety of options for understanding. There's always, I mean, in the end, it always looks like these national groups were fated to come out the way they came out. But in fact, it usually turns out there were lots of other options than the one that was chosen. So in Central Asia, they could have chosen to lump people together on the basis of sort of larger scale linguistic connections, because again, as is always the case in national development, none of these people knew they spoke a separate language, and none of these people did speak a separate language. They spoke a continuum of dialects across a rather large area. So they could have organized people as Turkic speakers. They could have organized people on the basis of Islam, which would have covered pretty much all of the peoples of Central Asia. And they could have also organized them on the basis of nomads versus settled people, which would have come up with a different way of organizing them. But in the end, both the Russians at the beginning and then the Soviets much more fully in the 1920s and 30s decided ultimately to create separate ethno-linguistic national groups. And one of my students just did a really interesting paper on how the Kyrgyz autonomous region, which then became the Kyrgyz Republic, was formed. And it turns out at that point, there were some very, very sharp debates about just who are these people? Where should they be? Do they stretch all the way from Semipalatinsk, where the most northern dialects of what we today call Kazakh, and all the way down to Narin, where the more southern dialects that we call Kyrgyz? Are they one group of people? Or should we focus on a smaller group of people? And there were very, very big debates. It's generally often felt that somehow Stalin drew lines and forced people. Stalin, I'm sure, did draw some lines and did force people sometimes. But overall, this was clearly a debate that the local people were having inside this Soviet state as to who they should be, who they might be. In any case, they formed ultimately five separate republics, each of which was the homeland in Soviet understanding of a particular nation: the Kyrgyz, the Kazakhs, Uzbeks, Tajiks, and Turkmen. But because this was the Soviet Union and it still functioned as an empire, there was no need to make sure that all the people from one nation lived in the same republic. In fact, it was encouraged for people to move from various republics or be in various republics. And it was also encouraged to have Russian and European settlement, some people call it colonialization, in Central Asia. There's lots of arguments going on now in Central Asia about to what extent Russian-Soviet colonization was a good thing for Central Asia. It's not a debate I want to have right now. Clearly, it's understood, however, much differently than colonialization is understood, let's say, in former British colonies and in former French colonies, and generally much more positively. I mean, in general, the belief among Central Asians is that overall Russian-Soviet colonization was a good thing for them. I have heard a lot of times people tell me if it weren't for the Russians, we would look like Afghanistan, which is, I mean, it all depends on what your comparative perspective is, I suppose, but that is a pretty generally held belief, although I'm sure there are people who, of course, think differently. But the result was that when the Soviet experiment came to an end in 1991, these states were extremely heterogeneous in terms of their populations. And just to say just how heterogeneous they were, let me just give you a few statistics. In 1989, Kazakhs made up 40% of the population of Kazakhstan, ethnic Kazakhs, or at least people who identified themselves as ethnic Kazakhs. While Russians constituted 38% and non-Muslim Europeans another 12%, that is Ukrainians, Jews, Germans, etc. So 50% of the population were non-Muslim, non-Asian in Kazakhstan, and only 40% were Kazakhs. In Kyrgyzstan in 1989, the Kyrgyz share of the population was approximately 52%, Uzbeks making up 14%, and Russians, together with non-Muslim others, made up another 38% of the population. So we're talking about states that had very large populations of Russians and Europeans, ethnics, and healthy populations of minorities like Uzbeks in Kyrgyzstan, and relatively small populations of the titular nationality. But the titular nationality definitely believed that the state belonged to it. I mean, when you talk to people in Kyrgyzstan, talk to Kyrgyz, they can't really agree who Kyrgyz people are. They can't really agree on what Kyrgyz people share. But that Kyrgyzstan belongs to the Kyrgyz, that's pretty much something that everybody can agree on. And I think that's true in all of the Central Asian states for all of the sort of lack of consolidation of the nation, which is the case in all of the states to a greater or lesser extent. The belief that this state belongs to us, whoever we are, the titular nationality, is very strongly held. And the belief, therefore, that others, whoever they might be, somehow don't belong there is also reasonably strongly held. In some cases, it's the kind of, well, of course they're welcome to stay, but basically they should know that they should know their place. That's kind of the most tolerant version, and the least tolerant is these people really have to go, which, and one way or the other, we're going to have to make that happen. Now, and fast forwarding 20 years to now, or 22 years to now, we can say that this process of national consolidation has happened remarkably quickly, remarkably well, in quotation marks if you're a nationalist, and remarkably without the kind of violence that we found in the Balkans. And the question of why this has happened so quickly, so well, and without very much violence is an extremely interesting question, because it tells us things about how people understand their rights and the world they live in, and how they manage to achieve the things they think are necessary for them to achieve. So I'll focus a little bit on Kyrgyzstan, because that's what I know best, but more or less the same things are happening everywhere else. First of all, the demographics have changed enormously. So if the Kyrgyz made up 52% of the population of Kyrgyzstan in 1989, they now make up close to 80% of the population. If in Kazakhstan, the Kazakhs made up 40%, they're now closer to 70% of the population in Kazakhstan. And the other Central Asian states are even more majority titular nation. So Turkmenistan is about 90% Turkmen at this point. Uzbekistan is about 85% Uzbek, 82, 83. And Tajikistan, well, yeah, what constitutes Tajikistan is even more difficult, because they're really not sure who Tajiks are. So we'll don't necessarily go there right now. But in any case, the most obvious thing is that you have a potentially a two-step process. In the Balkans, we also saw this as a two-step process. The colonizing nation goes first, and then once they've been gotten rid of, then attention is turned to the indigenous minorities. And that's exactly what's happened in the Balkans, except we haven't gotten to the indigenous minorities yet. And maybe we never will, which would be a good thing, but maybe we never will, we'll see. So what's happened is the Russians and non-Muslim, non-Asians have left in droves. And why they've left is incredibly interesting. When you talk, I mean, I spend a lot of time talking to my colleagues who are ethnic Russians and other people who are ethnic Russians in Bishkek. And if you say to them, well, you know, you guys used to make up 38% of the population, and now you make up 8% of the population of the country. What happened? Did anybody kick you out of here? Did you feel like you were forced to leave? Was there organized? No, there was certainly no organized violence against Russians. In fact, you can hear people will say, oh yes, people beat up a Russian here or there, or it happened, or once in a while you could hear on the streets, Russians go back to Russia. But basically, from the perspectives of the Balkans, let's say, which I'm used to, this was the most mild stuff you can imagine. And what's more, it's not as if the Russian economy in the 1990s, when all these people left, and they left very quickly between 1991 and 1995, although they're still leaving to this day. But it's not as if the Russian economy in the early 1990s was so spectacular, nor is it that case that the Russian state was so incredibly welcoming of these former Russians, none of whom, by the way, had lived in Russia ever. Almost none of them. They'd almost all been born in Kyrgyzstan or come to Kyrgyzstan as young people during the war or after the war. So it's really quite a sort of mystery. And the Kyrgyz, if you ask the Kyrgyz, well, why do you think these Russians all left? They'll all say, well, we didn't want them to leave. It was a huge tragedy that all these Russians left. They took with them all this expertise, all this knowledge. We didn't try to get them to leave. And yet, it appears that this logic of creating the single nation state is so strong that it kind of creates conditions that even if you don't use violence, there's lots of beliefs in the Balkans, it's because of wars, it's because of this, it's because of ancient hatreds, whatever. All these theories that all turn out to be wrong. It simply appears that when you create the nation state with a titular nationality at its core, that the logic of that kind of state appears to militate against the retention of minorities, even when you don't use particularly strong arm tactics to get rid of them. If you do use strong arm tactics, obviously you can get rid of more of them, but without that, even so, it seems to happen. And then if you look at the other parts, so the Russians have disappeared in all of these states. In Tajikistan, they're down to like 2% of the population of Tajikistan are ethnic Russians. Almost none. Turkmenistan, it's down to like 5%. So there are very few ethnic Russians, and most of the ones who are there are older people who grew up there, spent their whole lives there. Their children have all left and gone to Russia. They didn't want to leave, but it's pretty clear that there's not going to be a next generation of young Russians, at least not in any kind of quantities, in any of these countries. Even though, in most cases, the lingua franca of daily conversation is still Russian. Bishkek, though they're trying to switch, is still a Russian-speaking city, and it's pretty standard to see two ethnic Kyrgyz standing on the street speaking Russian with each other, much more frequent than seeing two ethnic Kyrgyz speaking Kyrgyz with each other. That's less true in Kazakhstan, where, by the way, the Russian population is nevertheless significantly larger, though more segregated. So you're seeing a situation where the Russians are disappearing. Russian language is not necessarily disappearing as fast, but it will also disappear within one generation, probably. So the sort of legacy of the colonial power, insofar as the Soviet Union, Russia was a colonial power, is disappearing very, very quickly. And then what's left are the indigenous minorities. So Uzbeks in Kyrgyzstan, Tajiks in Uzbekistan, and each of these countries has significant minority populations of indigenous minorities. And here, again, you see an interesting phenomenon by comparison to the Balkans. In the Balkans, what I would have expected is fairly serious bloodshed. In the southern part of Kyrgyzstan, Uzbeks make up somewhere around 40% of the population in the southern part of Kyrgyzstan. By the standards of a European nation state, that's just way too many people. They cannot absorb that many minorities. And there have been pogroms against Uzbeks in southern Kyrgyzstan in 1990, just before the end of the Soviet Union, and in 2010, after the most recent revolution. But again, by Balkan standards, these are pretty tame pogroms. Something like 300 Uzbeks were killed in 2010. One doesn't like people being killed no matter what, but by comparison to what Serbs did to Croatians or Bosnians and what Albanians have done to Serbs in Kosovo, etc., this is pretty small potatoes. So somehow there's not a strong, at least at this point, attempt to get rid of these indigenous minorities, though there is a very strong effort right now to assimilate them. And partially that is one answer to the question of what can happen. So in Kyrgyzstan, there's been a very strong effort to close all Uzbek language schools and essentially force all the Uzbek kids to speak Kyrgyz, presumably with the goal of saying, look, in one generation, they'll be Kyrgyz. They're not racist. I mean, it's not as if the Kyrgyz, believe that Uzbeks are somehow polluting them. As long as the Uzbeks have turned into Kyrgyz, that's okay. Exactly the same thing's happening in Uzbekistan with Tajiks, who historically controlled the main cities. Samarkand and Bukhara were Tajik cities. Tajik schools have been closed. Tajik media is closed. Tajiks are being forcibly, if you like, or somewhat forcibly, turned into Uzbeks. And if we say, so why didn't they go sort of the Balkan road? Why not sort of solve the problem in the good old-fashioned way? I think there's a couple of answers to that question. One of them has to do with the fact that Soviet internationalism actually worked better than Yugoslavism. So I think that these leaders and followers in Central Asia were less ethnically inclined, and certainly less inclined to see their neighbors as deadly enemies who had to be taken care of immediately. So that legacy of Soviet internationalism still stands, and they still, even while they're getting rid of all these minorities slowly and more or less humanely, they still stick to a kind of internationalist rhetoric, or at least some of these leaders do. And that's the second thing, is that all of the leaders, except in Kyrgyzstan, are Soviet leaders. So they themselves have this. And then even more important, none of them is democratically elected. And the problems of elections in unconsolidated national states, I think, are pretty clear from the Balkans. The fact that none of these leaders has to be elected, so therefore nobody has to run on a nationalist platform, which tends to whip up the enmity against smaller minority national groups, is clearly very important. And so for Westerners who keep pushing democracy on these places, at least until their nation states are consolidated, it's something that there are some serious issues as to whether one really wants to do that or not, or certainly whether one can expect. I mean, in Kyrgyzstan is the obvious case. So Kyrgyzstan, which is the most democratic, has the most serious ethnic problems, in part precisely because Kyrgyz politicians use nationalism as a way of mobilizing people, which politicians in Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan clearly don't do, because they don't have to mobilize anybody, because they don't have to actually stand for competitive elections. So those are some, but I mean, interestingly still, over some period of time, one can see that the results are trending in exactly the same direction. And so it is very likely that in relatively short future, like one generation or so, Central Asian states will look a great deal like the European states they're modeled on. That is, more or less monoethnic, more or less monolinguistic, with percentages of minorities hovering around 10%, 15%, which are numbers that in European consolidated nation states, as a rule, people have been able to deal with, especially when they're indigenous minorities. They have more trouble in European states now with exogenous ones like Turks in Germany or Arabs in France, but less problems with their own minorities, whom they somehow have learned to live with by now once they get down to a smaller number. So the danger points for all of these states are precisely what happens when political transition occurs in these extremely autocratic states, and what would happen if anyone actually had to contest elections. Uzbekistan is by far the most dangerous of these states, I think, because President Karimov is getting on in years. He's not going to be there forever. When he dies, I think not a lot of people have a good feeling that the state knows exactly what's going to happen. If they move to some situation where they have to democratize, that is, if someone doesn't manage to take power relatively quickly by him or her, in the case of his daughter, you may have a situation where people do have to use ethnic politics as a way of galvanizing support, and that could either be ethnic politics within the state against minorities in the state, or even more problematic, ethnic politics against neighboring states that are not treating our co-nationals very well. That would be Kyrgyzstan, for example. That's one potential problem. And the other potential problem is Kazakhstan, where also President Nazarbayev is not going to live forever, but they appear to have things a little bit under somewhat better control. And I think the general consent. And because the minority, they would have to tangle with are Russians, and tangling with Russians with the neighbor Russia next door is something that I think would be much harder for them to pull off. So my guess is Kazakhstan isn't going to be a huge problem, but it certainly could be. So what you see is a sort of remarkable kind of, as I say, slow motion development towards national consolidation without the excesses, if you like, without the huge bloodshed and wrenching warfare that characterized the Balkans, but nevertheless trending to exactly the same result. I guess I should add one final thing that I forgot. There's another difference in the Balkans has also been the international community. Many of these states, the weakest ones and the ones most likely to pick on their minorities, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, are so dependent on international aid, which they know to some extent is dependent on being nice to minorities, or at least saying you're going to be nice to minorities, that does militate against some of the worst behaviors that governments might choose to sponsor. States like Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, which are much less dependent on international aid, don't have to worry about that, but the Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan do. So that's kind of an overview of this Balkans in slow motion and national development. I hope that it said something to somebody, and if people have questions or thoughts or arguments or disagreements, I'm happy to entertain them and see what I can do. And if we want to have a discussion on this topic, we're welcome to do that. So thank you very much.
Now let's collect questions in Russian or in English. I'm going to pronounce them in English.
Gail, over there. Gail.
Yeah, Gail, of course.
Yeah.
That was a very interesting set of comparisons. But it strikes me that one big difference, and I wonder what influence you think it had, is that in all of these cases, there's one single ethnic group that is the largest minority, or the major minority, namely Russians. And so the fact that Russia, in effect, the colonial state is also the neighbor. What effect does that have, in a sense, in targeting the initial concerns or the initial stages of national development by defining the other as
Right.
Russia rather than the neighboring states?
Well, let's just say a couple different things. So first of all, the Russians could have made things much worse, which they didn't do, right? So, I mean, had the Russians chosen to see the exodus of Russians from Kyrgyzstan, let's say, Tajikistan, as a problem for them, or as something they wanted to somehow prevent from happening, or as somehow an excuse to attack or bother these neighboring states, that would have caused big problems. But of course, as you're well aware, in Russia between 1991 and 1995, they had many other serious problems to worry about rather than what they were going to do about these poor schleps Russians who were coming to Russia. They clearly didn't perceive it as a huge problem. And they didn't perceive, and I think correctly didn't perceive, that the reason this was happening was because somehow these Russians were being persecuted. I mean, I don't think this is a question of the Kyrgyz, let's say, or the Tajiks. Well, they left Tajikistan because there was a civil war going on. So, I mean, people leave when there's civil wars going on. But, I mean, I don't think Russians left Kyrgyzstan because they were being persecuted. I think they simply didn't feel, they understood the logic of the nation state. They understood that this was not their country. They understood that they didn't really have a long-term future here. And they left on their own, and the Russian government didn't feel it was a problem. Now, today, I mean, the only state now with a population of Russians worth worrying about is Kazakhstan. And the Kazakhs have moved, I mean, the Kazakhs in some sense are the most interesting because Kazakhstan still has a very strong rhetoric of internationalization on the one hand, and yet Kazakhstan has Kazakhified its country significantly more successfully than many of these other or these other Central Asian states. So in Kazakhstan at this point, it is not common to have Kazakhs not speaking Kazakh with each other. Kazakhs now feel embarrassed not to speak Kazakh. And it's also very uncommon to see Russians in any kind of visible political position or in visible education positions. So if you go to Nazarbayev University, which is the huge flagship project of President Nazarbayev that he's sunk billions of dollars into as the sort of future of Kazakhstan, there's something like 750 undergraduate students in a class. If there are more than 10 ethnic Russians in that group, I'd be shocked. I mean, you simply do not see ethnic Russians. And given that the population of ethnic Russians is something still like 25% in Kazakhstan, this is clearly a case of ethnic discrimination. I mean, it can't be an accident that there are practically no ethnic Russians among the students. And so on the one hand, the state is, moving to marginalize Russians, making sure that they don't have positions of authority in the state, in the government, at least not in the national government, federal government, and to remove them from the potential future leadership positions by not allowing them to be students in the leading university or universities. And yet, somehow, nobody says anything. Now, is this because the Russians in Russia don't care? I don't know. Maybe they don't notice. Maybe they still have many other problems that they have to face, and defending the interests of ethnic Russians in Kazakhstan is not something that has occurred to the Putin government as a primary need. And certainly the lack of any sort of physical repression. I mean, the Kazakhs are very intelligent. I mean, if they ever contemplated, doing anything physically dangerous to Russians, that does not happen. And the country has enough resources at this point that they can develop more or less things peacefully. And I think, the question of why Russians are leaving more slowly from Kazakhstan, they're leaving pretty quickly from Kazakhstan too. I mean, their population has dropped quickly, but not quite as quickly as from other places. I think Russians still do feel they have a place in the economy, as they do in Kyrgyzstan as well. So there's not anyone forcing anyone to leave. But so I think the Russians simply, when the time was that they could have made a strong intervention, they didn't because they couldn't. And by the time they could have, either the damage was done if you felt like you wanted them. What the Russians do instead is now, at least in places like Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, they're simply buying the place. So, Kyrgyzstan is now owned by Russia. And the Kyrgyz government has basically just sold off practically the entire infrastructure of the country to Russian interests. So perhaps the Russian government feels like they can control Kyrgyzstan insofar as they want to relatively cheaply by buying it, and they don't have extra people. They are concerned about their own demographic implosion, clearly. So perhaps from the Russian point of view, getting the ethnic Russians back to Russia is not a bad thing at all. And if they want to control the place, they can just own it, and that will solve the problem, perhaps.
Boris.
I assume you had some knowledge of the region before coming to the region. To what extent this knowledge was challenged? What was a kind of shocking experience? What was unpredictable for you?
So, that's a very good question. So whenever you move someplace else, you have some ideas about how things will be. So, the thing that I'm most surprised at in Kyrgyzstan is how little the Kyrgyz agree on what it means to be Kyrgyz. They are such an unconsolidated nation by comparison to the nations that I know of in the Balkans, let's say, or Western Europe. I just did this exercise with my students. We have to teach, the Kyrgyz government has announced that all students in every university in Kyrgyzstan must take a course in Manasovedение, so studying the epic Manas, which as far as I know is the only country in the world that has declared that all university students must study some individual literary or cultural text. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe there's another one, but I don't know of anyone. So we had to figure out how we were going to do this at our liberal arts university in Central Asia. And we came up with some, I hope, interesting ways to do it. But I was teaching a section. I decided I was going to run this course because we don't really have too many literature faculties, so I know something. So we did this little exercise last week in terms of thinking about ideology of forcing people to learn something like this. And I asked all the students to write down the 3 things they thought made Kyrgyz people Kyrgyz. And the extent to which they were all over the map and not sort of in any kind of way consolidated. The way, I mean, I know if I said in Croatia, if I went to Croatia and I said, give me 3 things that make Croatians Croatian, I would get Croatian language, Catholicism, 1, 2, from 100% of students. I don't care. Well, maybe 95%. But there'd be no question at all that everybody would pretty much say this. In Kyrgyzstan, no one says language, even though this is a supposedly ethno-linguistic state. Like one student out of, I did like this for 4 different focus groups, one student out of 50 students chose language as what he or she thought made the Kyrgyz Kyrgyz. Very few of them chose religion, although they're all Muslims. In principle, they're all Muslims. You know, and they ranged from we eat a lot of meat to we're late all the time to, I mean, all sorts of things that are to geographical features of the country rather than the people. So, I mean, there's a very, very low level of agreement, which is actually, in my feeling, a little bit dangerous for the country because that makes minorities the one thing they can all agree on. We're all Kyrgyz because we're not Uzbeks, or we're all Kyrgyz because we're not Russians. That they would all agree on, but that they didn't use as a marker either. But so that lack of national consolidation surprised me. And I guess the other thing I'm always surprised when I go there is when I'm living there, despite the penetration of the internet in places like Tajikistan and Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, these are still incredibly isolated countries. What people sort of on a day-to-day basis sort of know about the world is very random. And in most cases, I mean, you know, there are all these polls about Americans can't find, you know, England on the map or something. Yes, I know that. But I mean, the Kyrgyz, again, this is not to be insulting to the Kyrgyz or anybody else. It's a very isolated place. People really don't know much about their place in the world. And it's sort of like, I mean, I was at this conference once where someone said, the problem with Cyprus is that every morning the Prime Minister of Cyprus wakes up and says, I wonder what the US President is thinking about Cyprus today. The Kyrgyz are something like that. It's like, what do the US think about Kyrgyzstan today? And when you try to explain to them that Kyrgyzstan is not the center of the world, and that many people, you know, have never heard of it, they're quite shocked and horrified by this idea. And I think that's true in Kazakhstan too, where they think of themselves as this incredible world power at this point. And when you tell them that, you know, even most like French people would not be able to tell you anything about Kazakhstan. They're completely horrified. So those are a couple things I found surprising in Central Asia.
More questions? Maria? Sergey? And then... Yep.
I have 2 questions that I would like to raise. So first of all, you make this very elegant comparison of Balkan states and of Central Asian states, and I wonder how in this slide you would think that, okay, the Balkans more or less all have one big idea in mind okay, some countries already joined the EU, Croatia being the latest, and some are on the way there sooner or later, say it's a question, sometimes of 5 years, sometimes of 10 years, maybe more, we will see. Central Asian states don't have this kind of clear idea of the union they should join, be it, say, customs union that Kazakhstan joined also recently, or it can be maybe some Islamic union, at least Tajikistan is torn between many directions it can go. So how does this fit in your pictures? And the second question, very different one, is how do you see American University Central Asia in this context, and what do you think is its mission in this respect, in the respect of building the Kyrgyz nation or being the international university in the region? How is it different from
Those are great questions. So, I mean, the first place, though, I would say when the Balkan states became independent, they didn't have any EU to join either in the 19th century or into the 20th century. So it's only relatively recently that this option of joining some larger union became an option, and they tried out a variety of different concepts of alliances and ententes and in between fighting with each other, allying with each other, and trying to fend off bigger, more powerful neighbors in various ways. So in some sense, again, the Balkans is like a latecomer to the table going through the same thing. On the other hand, I think you're correct in guessing, although I'm guessing that you're guessing, that there's not going to be any kind of useful international alliance that they could join anytime soon, so they are going to have to choose. Now, Kyrgyzstan between 2005 and 10 at least did a pretty good job of figuring out a way to play off the Americans against the Russians, against the Chinese, and against the Turks. But that's a very difficult thing to do, and that's now coming to an end. The Americans are basically leaving Central Asia almost completely. That's fairly clear, so we're no longer going to play a serious role. We can't bail anybody out or help them in a major way. So now they're kind of stuck with the Russians and the Chinese, which is not a good choice, let us say, for any of these countries. And they're making different choices. As I say, Kyrgyzstan has chosen to sell the entire country to the Russians. Tajikistan pretty much as well. I mean, in both cases, there's so many migrant workers from these countries working in Russia that the Russians completely can stop, at least they think they can stop these countries in their tracks anytime. All they have to do is threaten to send all the migrants home, and these countries would collapse in 15 seconds. The Russian economy too might collapse, not economy, but Russian daily life might collapse, but that's a different story. So I think, in any case, these countries believe that if they were to do something that made the Russians unhappy, the Russians would retaliate in ways that would be unacceptable. And so they basically will not go against the Russians. Plus, as I said, their experience of Russian colonialization was not so negative. So most people in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan are not particularly afraid of the Russians. I personally think they should be more afraid of them, but that's my Cold Warrior leftover mentality, perhaps. They don't think that's a problem. On the other hand, they're terrified of the Chinese, absolutely terrified. The extent to which you ask people, what, first of all, nobody learns Chinese, which is amazing. We're 200 miles away from China, and the world economy, you can look around and see what's going on, and I can't get students willing to learn Chinese. And in general, the other universities in town can't either, because they just want to pretend China's not there. It's like, no, they don't really exist. And so that fear of the Chinese, combined with the sort of lack of fear of the Russians, leads to a situation where, at least in these two most vulnerable countries, they've made their choice. Politically, they've made their choice. Kazakhstan, because it's the richest by far, and because Nazarbayev, for all his faults, is no dummy, has figured out a reasonable way to have enough, what they consider enough sovereignty, and yet be part of this Russian. But they almost see themselves as a union of equals, almost. I mean, they're not, but still, they can pretend more or less they are. Uzbekistan seems to be trying to run, and Turkmenistan both seem to be trying to run kind of autarkic states in a very strange way. I mean, the Uzbeks, try not to deal with anybody and not be dependent on anybody, except for water from Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, with whom they have big problems and will have bigger problems when the water gets more problematic. And Turkmenistan, because it has its own resources in the form of natural gas primarily that they're busy selling to the Chinese. Both of these countries are big sellers of natural gas to the Chinese, but they're not as worried about the Chinese because the Chinese are farther away and there's a buffer zone of Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan between them. So they seem to be able to be more independent in terms of their politics. In terms of what we should do as a university, I think this is a case where, so we have a number of responsibilities. Our student body is about 70% Kyrgyz citizens and about 25% citizens of the other Central Asian countries, with Afghanistan included. And so clearly one of the roles we have is we are one of the few places, perhaps the only place in Central Asia, where elites from these countries actually have anything to do with each other. Because, as was the case in Eastern Europe, as is the case in Central Asia, one of the collateral damages of the end of the Soviet Union is the people who used to deal with each other, neighbors, no longer do. True, they used to have to deal through Moscow and sometimes, only met in Moscow, but still they met. And now they really have very little to do with each other. So we are one place where students who are, in many cases, going to become leaders of these countries, at least we hope so, have had the opportunity to deal with people from other countries in their daily life as students. That said, we don't propagate an enormous kind of, multi-culti, everybody should be nice to their neighbors policy. At least I don't. And since I'm the one who teaches courses on nationalism and Manasavedini, I'm the one who they hear it from. So I basically say to all these students, look, it's not our job to tell you how to organize your countries. It's our job to tell you what might be the various scenarios. If you choose to do one thing, what would be the negative effects or potentially positive effects? You're the ones who have to make the choice. I don't think that we know. I mean, again, especially with nationalities policy, I said to them, if the Europeans had a good model for you to follow that was multi-ethnic and multicultural, I would tell you that they should impose it on you. But since the Europeans have no model to propose, since the only thing any European state ever did was kill off its national minorities or kick them out, they have no business telling you how you should do this. They can tell you and should tell you which is, if you do this, look at these things that aren't so nice that will happen. But since they can't tell you how to make a consolidated, functioning national state by starting with liberal ideas and going to national ideas later. They all did it by having national ideas first and liberal states later. So they have no business telling you anything. You have to figure this out, and there is no good model for doing this. There are definite problems with every possible model that's out there. So it's your job. So I think that's our job as a good university should be to empower students or make them feel empowered to make choices while simultaneously at least making them aware of what are the likely consequences of the choices that they make, and realizing that there's no great choice. I mean, I don't think it's possible in these countries where the titular nationality thinks they own the country, I don't think it's possible for them to have functioning liberal states until they've solved their national consolidation problems. I personally do not think that's possible. But how they're going to get there without being unpleasant and violent towards their minorities, well, they seem to be getting there slowly. And maybe all one can say is the longer they don't have democracy for another generation, the better, because that's the most dangerous, for minorities, that's the most dangerous thing that can happen, though there are obviously lots of good sides to it too. But
this is the most anti-democratic talk I've heard in this hall for the last year. Sergey, please. I'm not a student of it.
I was very curious about this peaceful departure of the Russians. And I was wondering, were many of these Russians sent there either by the military or by some administrative capacity?
Nope.
And another question I had, is we were talking about democracy for another generation or so. You said you're not going to put off a leadership change for long in most of these places, and they've been kept reasonably peaceful because of the Soviet-style control. Can we not expect that in the struggle for power that will follow, they will play the ethnic card and then break out into a kind of open scenario?
Well, let's start with the last one. We can expect that there is a chance that will happen, yes. And certainly these states, there's no question these states are massively better off if it happens now than they would have been if it had happened in 1992. If these states with the size of the minority populations they had in 1992 had done sort of full-scale democracy, it would not have been a pretty sight. No matter how much people think, no matter how much I think they did imbibe a certain Soviet internationalism, I don't think that would have worked. It's possible now that minority populations are small enough, and that won't be necessary, or politicians won't find it to be a particularly attractive card. In Kyrgyzstan, as I say, it also depends how much leeway these people think they have. This is a case where in Kyrgyzstan there's definitely a limit to what nationalist politicians can do, which is imposed by the outside. It won't be imposed in Uzbekistan, because Uzbekistan, we can't impose anything on Uzbekistan. But my guess is Uzbekistan has small enough minority populations at this point that probably it will turn out okay, but I can't guarantee. I mean, certainly the next Uzbek leader, especially if they have to contest for power, is likely to be significantly more nationalist than Karimov is. That, I think, one can guarantee. And, I mean, one thing, for example, in Kyrgyzstan, when anti-Uzbek pogroms were going on in 2010, Karimov did nothing to help his co-nationals. I mean, that's in the Balkan scenarios, that doesn't happen. When your co-nationals are being attacked by, or potentially even going to be attacked by somebody, you go in and you help them out, which obviously makes the situation significantly worse. That didn't happen for a variety of reasons. But what would happen, once you had a more nationalist leader there, they might feel constrained to do some cross-border experimentation. So there are definitely some issues. In terms of why the Russians were there, I mean, first of all, many of these Russians were there for 3 or 4 generations. I mean, they may have been sent by the Tsarist government in 1900, but by their time their grandchildren were there, they didn't feel like they had been sent. They did feel like this was their homeland. A lot of them came during World War II as refugees, either forced refugees or, with their whole factories that were exported to Central Asia to start building munitions, and then again stayed after the war. So, I mean, rather few of these people felt like, it's not like in the Baltic states where a lot of these people were specifically sent there to sort of dilute the national essence. I mean, in Kazakhstan, there have been lots of Russian colonization since the 1860s. So that, and again, I mean, it's interesting the level to which, local people, don't remember or don't blame Russians, or don't usually blame Russians for rather horrible things. I mean, in 1916, by most of the historical accounts I've seen, about a quarter of the Kyrgyz population was wiped out by the Russian army. This is not something the Kyrgyz somehow, walk around holding a grudge about. Why they don't, I don't know, but I guess it's a good thing they don't, but they don't. Certainly a lot of Kazakhs were treated extremely badly by both Tsarist Russia and Soviet Russia, and yet it doesn't seem to be something that they hold a grudge about the same way that in the Balkans people really did hold grudges. So these Russians felt at home. I mean, on the other hand, of course, it's unbelievably rare to find a Russian who learned any of the local language. I mean, they just didn't do it. And even now in Kazakhstan, where the country really has Kazakhified, it's very hard to find ethnic Russians who will speak, reasonable Kazakh. And in Kyrgyzstan, I know very, very few Russians who speak any Kyrgyz. So they never felt the need to, go native if that's the way you want to look at it.
Can you press the button?
Any button you like.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. Is that actually a follow-up question to the second one that Professor asked? You said you did 4 focus groups of the classes that you teach. And so the question is that what makes it Kyrgyz to be, what does it mean to be
What they thought, I mean.
Yeah, and you said the answers were quite randomly scattered. But what was the most frequently written answer?
I think I didn't do a final tally to see who won, but I mean they did. The one thing they did mostly mention were some versions of our customs, whatever they thought their customs were, toy of various kinds, and I mean you could mostly you could combine them into a variety of things, but they mostly came down to customs. And then I said we had this one girl in the class from Yakutia. And she said, well, it's not up in Yakutia, nobody speaks Yakut, and yet we all know who we are. Why do you Kyrgyz? That's the other thing about doing this that was interesting, was that, of course, not all the kids in the class were Kyrgyz, so the external people were saying what they thought Kyrgyz people were based on their experience of living in Kyrgyzstan. And she said, well, I don't see what's the big problem with you guys and your language. I mean, you can just be like the Yakuts and have your customs and don't worry about your language. And then that ensued a long discussion as to whether in the end they all agreed that my Kyrgyz students, ethnic Kyrgyz students, all agreed that somehow language is a problem. There was a general belief that this was a problem that had to be addressed, and that the Kyrgyz should all speak Kyrgyz, and there's something wrong with the fact that they don't, and that someone should do something about it. So then I appointed a couple of honorary ministers of education and told them to explain to the class what they intended to do about solving this problem. So we now have and then the Minister of Education was at a conference on Manasavedina the other day, and I said to him, well, I've appointed 5 successors to you, each of whom has ideas about how to fix your language problem. So he was very happy to hear that, I can assure you.
So you think the United States
The United States is not an ethnically constituted country. I mean, again, the United States is always a bad comparison to use, in my view.
I'll get back to students' questions in a second, but Professor Frank first, and then the three of you.
I'm worried by this defense of dictatorship.
It's not really a
Maybe
defense
you're-
of dictatorship.
It's the same argument which, not surprisingly, I heard in a talk by Nazarbayev a year or so ago. Democracy, but not yet, and always not yet, the favourite argument of the dictator. Genocide is not a monopoly of democracies, never has been, and one should perhaps, one needs to look at the distribution of genocide and the treatment of minorities rather than focus on the areas in which it's been difficult in democracies. But even in former Soviet space, I mean, to take what might seem like a counterintuitive example at the moment, which would be Ukraine, which nobody would call a stable country, but nor is it a fundamentally genocidal country. Mm-hmm. It is a country with tensions, but tensions which are within the parameters of civil society, broadly speaking. And a definition of Ukrainian-ness, so to speak, which right at the beginning was defined geographically with ethnic or linguistic tensions within it. It's not an idealistic version of it. One doesn't need democracies, don't have to be perfectly harmonious in order to be functioning democracies. Indeed, democracies shouldn't be harmonious in order to be functioning democracies. So the fear of tensions is not in itself a defense of dictatorship.
I would agree. I mean, what I would say, though, is these countries in Central Asia did consider themselves the homelands of their titular people quite clearly. I mean, there was no question that the Uzbeks think that Uzbekistan is, I mean, it's in its name, it's set, that's that. I mean, Ukraine has always been weird because the name itself is somehow geographical, right? It's not entirely national. All these stans, I mean, they belong to somebody or other. And it is, I think at this point, in fact, if there were to be a serious democratic process certainly in all the countries except Uzbekistan, I think there really would not be a significant problem. I mean, I think because in Kazakhstan, the sort of way things have been divided up, the Kazakhs, I mean, first of all, you can't go after Russians. I mean, you just can't. It's the same thing is true in Ukraine. I mean, if the minority in Ukraine had not been Russians, things might be different. But I mean, Russians are off bounds. You can do various things that might encourage them to leave, but to actually attack Russians physically is not an option. So that means that in Kazakhstan, you don't really have a problem. I mean, the minority group is primarily Russians. They are primarily loyal to the state. It won't do any politician any good to stir up ethnic tensions with Russians. So they're fine. They could have, so Nazarbayev can go to bed and retire, and they can have democratic politics there. I mean, democratic politics are a problem in Tajikistan, not for ethnic reasons, but for religious reasons. And there, what's going to happen to Tajikistan is anybody's guess. I mean, that place is a mess. And it's not a question. I mean, democracy would only make the mess worse, but it wouldn't neither solve the fundamental problems nor destroy the fundamental problems. But it certainly, I mean, a full-blown democratic election in Tajikistan would probably not be something you could do. I mean, so I don't even. Kyrgyzstan runs a democratic country more or less, and it hasn't led to total disaster, so it's okay. And Turkmenistan, it has very few minorities at this point, so it's not really an issue. So Uzbekistan is really the one problematic place. It's by far the biggest. It has problems with all of its neighboring states, so this is not just a question of being aggressive towards your own potential minorities, but also towards neighbors where there are lots of Uzbeks who aren't necessarily being treated well, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, with whom you also have other bones to pick. So, I mean, that country, I think, is going to be a problem, but that's going to be a problem whether it's democracy or not, because whoever gets to become president will almost certainly have to use nationalism as a way to get the job, regardless of whether he or she is elected or appointed or self-appointed. So I think Uzbekistan is going to become a significantly more nationalist country going forward, no matter who runs it and how they get there.
Okay, let's get more questions from students, and then we're done. We've got 3 more questions over there. So yeah.
First off, thank you very much. That's a fascinating talk. My question is, in your opinion, do you find that regionalism still plays a huge part in dividing the country? For example, do you think it's a problem with people identifying themselves as Kyrgyz because they still hold on to their identities within their specific regions? How does that play into it?
Certainly the Kyrgyz are regionally focused still. And when Kyrgyz people meet each other, they usually ask, where are you from? And the answer, Bishkek, is not a good enough answer. It's like, and where were your parents and grandparents from, which has to be somewhere else. So that definitely plays some part. And certainly tensions between the north and south of the country still are significant. But to me, the tensions are more along the lines that the south of the country is more Kyrgyzified than the north, which is still more Russified. So those tensions play themselves out that way. I mean, the people in the north seem to get along with each other fine, from Isykyul or Narin or Bishkek or Talas. It's that divide between the south and the north where you really feel it. But still, I mean, Bishkek is clearly becoming less and less that way. I mean, I have a very interesting group of Kyrgyz friends who all come from various parts of Kyrgyzstan, and they all spend their time together in the typical way that groups of friends do in that country, and they only speak Kyrgyz with each other, although they're all capable of speaking Russian perfectly well. They've chosen to speak Kyrgyz, and they come from all parts of the country, and they make fun of each other on the basis of that, but it's kind of good fun the way we do in the US of someone coming from Tennessee, and you say, ha ha, you Southern rubes, or whatever. I mean, it's clearly not serious. So I think that may be changing going forward, but it's certainly an issue.
I wanted to ask about religion specifically. It's kind of, I guess, a two-part question, but you can probably answer it all as one. So, to what extent did Islam play sort of a cohesive role or a role in mitigating the kind of ethnic violence that you saw in the Balkans, where you had not only Serbs, Albanians, Christians, Bosnians, but you had Muslims, Orthodox Christians, Catholics, all sorts of different groups. And of course, you have religious diversity in Central Asia as well, but especially after a lot of the non-Muslim minorities left after the fall of the Soviet Union. To what extent do you see that as a factor, either mitigating ethnic violence and going forward in terms of nationalism? What role do you see religion, specifically Islam, playing as either something that people can build their kind of a common identity upon, or something that divides people?
Well, unfortunately, as you probably know, in terms of ethnic people or people fighting, you can choose lots of things to fight about. Jonathan Swift, described the people who opened the egg on one side versus the other side in the early 1700s as the. So I mean, if you want to fight with your neighbors, you'll find something that will set you apart from your neighbors. So I don't think that the fact that they were all nominally Muslim prevented anybody from fighting with each other. But it was one less thing to fight about, I suppose. But in Tajikistan, the difference between people who wanted more Islam versus people who wanted less was essentially the base of the civil war. So, Islam wasn't necessarily, though they were all Muslim. I mean, nominally both sides were nominally Muslim. So it can be much more a question of what kind of Islam that you want. All the governments of Central Asia are officially or unofficially terrified of Islam, at least Islam in the so-called fundamentalist variety that they see coming from Afghanistan and potentially from Iran, I suppose, and even from Saudi Arabia. They use that for all sorts of nefarious purposes. I mean, it's constant. Anyone they don't like is always accused of being an Islamic terrorist, unless they're accused. Well, there's a few things you can categorize them, but being an Islamic terrorist is high on the list in all countries of Central Asia. Is something that will get you into trouble, regardless of how Islamic you are or not. I think that we're seeing in Kyrgyzstan, some Islamification of the country, if you like, in the sense that, but primarily caused, I think, by the fact that in terms of who's leaving the country to go to work, let's say in Russia, they tend to be people from the north, and Bishkek in particular, who are less Muslim, and they're being replaced by people from the south who are more Muslim identified. So it's not necessarily that the country as a whole is becoming less Muslim or more Muslim, but some groups of people who were felt themselves less Muslim, moved and others came in. But the question of, what does Muslim, one of the young ladies in my focus group, my accidental focus group, who was one of the few young women who wears a headscarf at the university, other than the ones from Afghanistan, said, well, there's an interesting problem because a lot of Kyrgyz practices are opposed to Muslim practices, and I can't do both. And I said to her, and so did a number of the other people in the class, well, you realize that Islam has been here for a while, like 500 years, and somehow, for those 500 years, people didn't see these things as being opposed to each other. Apparently, your family practices a version of Islam, which, at least in their view, is incompatible with certain processes or ways of being that have been felt to be compatible for some long period of time. And she was aware that that was the case, but that didn't solve the problem. So it can work at cross purposes with national identity. It could work to strengthen certain kinds of national identity. It certainly doesn't help them separate themselves from each other. That is, it doesn't help Kyrgyz separate from Kazakhs because they're both Muslim. So it's not used as a marker for hard national identity, like we are X and therefore we're different from Y.
And last person.
Thanks very much for your talk. It's been very interesting. You mentioned this a little bit earlier, and I was wondering if you could expand upon it a little bit more. But I see the role of migrant laborers in Kyrgyzstan and in Tajikistan in really exposed and vulnerable situation of the state based on percentage of GDP that those nations earn. Migrant laborers who go to Russia primarily. I'm wondering if you could share your thoughts on the long-term prospects of this and the social effects at home of having large numbers of population gone.
Yeah, we have a very good policy center, and one of the things that policy center studies is precisely those sets of issues in both directions. That is, what happens to those people when they come to Russia and what happens to Kyrgyzstan when they leave Kyrgyzstan. As with all issues of migrant labor, it's a massively mixed picture. There's an enormous building boom going on in Bishkek right now, fueled entirely by remittances. So at least at some level, it has a strongly positive effect on the local economy. It's pretty obvious that if all those people were home, in quotation marks, neither Kyrgyzstan nor Tajikistan could function. If there were an extra million unemployed men floating around Kyrgyzstan, or a couple million unemployed men floating around Tajikistan, these countries would obviously collapse. But I'm not sure, the question of how vulnerable they are, that always assumes that the, quotes, host country could somehow actually get rid of these laborers. The same debate happens in the United States, Mexico is vulnerable, and there are all these people in the United States who want to get rid of Mexican migrant laborers. Well, in some sense, the smartest thing the Mexican migrant laborers could ever do would be to call a general strike for 2 days in the United States, and the whole country would stop. And then that would end that conversation, because it would be pretty clear that the United States cannot function without these 11 million or so illegal aliens, of whom, well, they're not all Mexicans, but a reasonable percentage are, plus legal ones. So the exact same thing is true here. if all the Tajiks and Kyrgyz went on strike tomorrow, I don't think this country would function all that well. So I'm not sure that the country is that either Kyrgyzstan or Tajikistan is so vulnerable actually to somehow these people all being sent home, because, I think they're vulnerable politically, and they do feel vulnerable politically, I said so earlier, but I don't think they're as vulnerable as they think they are, because I don't think the Russian economy could do without these people, and therefore the likelihood someone would actually play that card and try to send all these people home is extremely unlikely. So it's kind of this dance where everybody pretends that this is a huge problem, but in fact it's not really a huge problem for anybody, except for those poor migrant laborers themselves. For them it's a huge problem. They get treated extremely badly, as do Mexican illegals in the United States, and from all accounts illegals here. So for them it's a tragedy, but for the states in question, I'm not really sure it's such a tragedy.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah. Well, I think I will have to wrap it up, I'm sorry. And I apologize for putting the last question in Russian, actually. Я знаю, Андрей, что вы сам преподаете, несмотря на то, что административной работы много, но для удовольствия и для другой миссии вы преподаете русскую литературу в этом университете.
Это бывает, да.
А вот как вы видите роль этого в контексте того, что нам только что рассказали? Вы пытаетесь остановить отток русских, вы пытаетесь доколонизовать местное население, то есть вы пытаетесь показать, что есть нормальная Islamic Studies в Америке. Вот кроме того, что просто дает вам удовольствие.
Нет, но дело в том, что я хочу, чтобы наши студенты умели читать, потому что наши студенты, как студенты и в Штатах, и, может быть, даже в России, хотя я не знаю, в России, они уже забыли читать. То есть они могут на 5 экранах смотреть одновременно и получить оттуда информацию, это да. А читать нормальный роман они не в состоянии. Поэтому они не умеют это делать ни на английском языке, ни на кыргызском языке, ни на русском языке. Поскольку русская литература — это то, что я знаю, я преподаю русскую литературу. Я не считаю, что надо обязательно преподавать русскую. Можно английскую, можно американскую, хотя я не люблю ее. Но поэтому я преподаю русскую литературу не потому, что это русская литература, а потому что это литература. И они должны уметь анализировать сложные тексты, и они должны остановиться и обратить внимание на то, что они читают. А вот это то, что они не умеют. Они хотят читать роман за 5 минут. А когда ты им объясняешь, что читать, не знаю, «Мертвые души» за 5 минут, то есть да, я могу дать вам как бы краткое содержание за 3 предложения, а читать роман как-то требует немножко времени. Это важно для вас не потому, что вы получите удовольствие от этого, я надеюсь, но самое важное, даже если вы не получите удовольствие, вам придется чуть-чуть остановиться, чуть-чуть обратить внимание на то, что ты читаешь, и тогда есть хоть какой-то шанс, что ты поймешь, что да, ты можешь получить от этого удовольствие и, может быть, даже что-то полезное, потому что если у тебя нет возможности сосредоточиться, ты ничего не будешь делать. Мне все равно, сколько экранов ты можешь читать, но время от времени все-таки нужно тратить немножко времени.
Спасибо. Я перестал читать свой экран. Решил посмотреть на вас.
Это тоже хорошо.
Чему-то научиться. И закончить нашу сессию саморазвития сегодня аплодисментами.
Спасибо.